So there's people talking about ivermectin only working on people with parasites. Okay, so I'm going to do this in this order. First is to just, I think, resolve the issue. The second is to deal with what Bitterman and Codex Man are doing. So anyway, there are 10 papers on IVM meta that deal with mortality and ivermectin usage in places that do not have endemic worms. I'm not going to be digging around beyond that. There are probably more. I'm just going to show these here, and then, and the individual ones are linked. This is not some great research thing. I'm literally just parroting IVM meta, right? I'm just being a parrot, breaking it down, what he's already done. And then there's the policy coincidences on Czechia and Slovakia, the introduction of ivermectin and the decline in all-cause mortality. So here's what's kind of skeevy about what Codex Man is doing on this. Most of the studies on ivermectin are done outside of weird countries, Western, educated, quote-unquote, industrialized, quote-unquote, and RD stands for something. At least those available today are mostly done outside of what are called weird countries. This makes sense, as the reach of this kind of Western institution Borg has less impact outside of weird countries. But see, then you have this worm theory thrown down. And I don't want to engage in mind reading. However, what I'm saying is that this worm theory happens to be a theory that just so happens to exclude the bulk of the research on ivermectin and constrain you to a limited set in order to deal with their theory that they, not that they say you have to deal with, but that I believe they think you have to deal with. And here, from this page, it restricts you to 10 studies because now you can only look at these kinds of studies. It's like the game Inscription, where in the middle of the battle, the boss just starts eliminating your cards. Oh, can't use those, there be worms. So you've got some studies that show place in Egypt with worms, ivermectin has big effect. Place in Egypt without worms, ivermectin, no effect. And I saw a chart from The Economist, but the article is paywalled. But whatever, here's the chart. This is the basic of the argument. And they did this and found this, and I'm not going to needle that result. Okay, but the problem with this, what's the punchline from this? The punchline is, and it's been a few days since I read Codex Man's article, but the punchline is it won't work in places like Florida, Australia, France, Argentina, Czechia, or Slovakia because those places don't have endemic worms. Okay, that's the punchline, and you have to keep that in mind. It's like, okay, that's a nice idea. What's the punchline? And then the obvious question, why don't we just test the punchline? So I have individual studies and policy switch effects saying they do have a big effect. This is what's so bogus about this exclusion. So worms, look at this thing from Egypt and maybe Iran or somewhere else. Therefore ivermectin won't work on COVID outside of wormland. Problem, studies showing it works outside of wormland. Okay? Then we get to the next thing here. Not statistically significant. Now, okay, this is like kind of like the talk. Like statistical significance is it's hollow as a predictor. It's not valid for what it is you're trying to do here. Now, I shouldn't have to do this because you should just go, yeah, actually, I was never shown any kind of validation for statistical significance or why I should care if something is statistically significant. So I'm going to stop having an opinion on whether it's necessary to have statistical significance until I do get some kind of validation for why this tool, statistical significance, or P, should be used. Right? But You won't do that because it's done in journals a whole bunch of times, and so it must be done for a reason, right? It's a convention. The prevalence of the convention proves its validity for something. That's kind of the implicit reasoning. Once it's made explicit, of course, then it's... but by slicing out the non-Western data because worms, this then makes the remaining studies done in proper wormless areas no longer statistically significant, see? Where when you included all of them, it was statistically significant. So, now I don't buy into statistical significance. I recommend a video, The Dance of the P-Values, for an introduction as to why it's not useful. There's more on it. Basically, statistical significance doesn't carry the weight of prediction. That once you take into account N and effect size, statistical significance in and of itself doesn't matter. So to visualize what they're doing, I'm just using the IVM Meta site here. I'm not saying that this is everything on the matter, but this is a decent collection. So here's their mortality studies. Oh, big effects. And as it happens, statistically significant effects. I don't care about that, but they do. But worms, you see, can't use these. You can only use these. Oh, look, it's not statistically significant anymore. Okay, also publication bias. Again, Bitterman used a funnel analysis, which is another thing that probably doesn't work. I know of an empirical test from 2005 with known data sets that did or didn't have fraud. Okay, now to back up here, just a really quick thing on how publication bias is detected, and it has to do with probability and distributions. Say you have a drug. The drug has an effect on people, say it's a 0.5 standard deviation effect. Standard deviation sizes are based on how much variance there is within the distributions, blah, blah, blah. It's all relative. A big effect is relative to how much variation already exists within a population. Okay. So the basic principle of identifying publication bias, I'm most familiar with funnel analyses, but there are others. But the basic principle is that real data has noise. So an expected amount of variation even when there's a real effect. So sometimes, even if there is a real causal effect of a drug, you will expect to see from time to time some studies which say 100 subjects showing a negative association between a drug and a real effect. Even if the effect is totally real, sometimes you just get a weird batch in people for whom there is a negative association between the drug and the real effect of that drug. And so you expect a kind of distribution of these results, right? And based on the sample size, you expect it to roughly conform to the shape of a funnel with the higher power studies going up towards the tip at the top, and the lower power studies with lower sample sizes as one of the criterion being spread out around the bottom. Big negative, big positive effect, big deviations from the median / mean. You expect to sort of funnel out, and that's because of distribution. And so if there is publication bias, that is bias against publishing research in one direction or another, you would expect to see something like this, right? You would expect values sort of from one side to be taken off. So basically it's like there's too much variation within each study for how the effect is always positive. Like we expect to see more data points over here because of the funnel. So that sounds pretty nice, right? So first, let's look at the ability of researchers to be able to visually identify publication bias. This was a paper entitled, "In an empirical evaluation of the funnel plot, researchers could not visually identify publication bias." Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. This is just a visual looking at the funnel, okay? And what they did was they created a bunch of fake data sets, lots of fake data. Okay, so they have a bunch of fake data, and then they censor or remove a few studies. With all the studies are fake, but they remove a few of them out of the batch, which is what you would see if there actually was publication bias. So they simulated an amount of publication bias on data. You don't need to know the subject matter to do this kind of analysis, although you should, and I'll get into that. But they're just looking at the statistical methods, and they gave the data sets to a bunch of researchers, told them to make funnel plots of this data, and say if there was publication bias based on a visual inspection of the funnel plot. Now, I'm going to do something here. I rarely do this, so don't take this as something that you should do generally, but the authors actually gave as far as I can tell, bullshit-free explanation of their results in the abstract. So here's what they said. Quote, on average, participants correctly identified 52.5% confidence intervals of the plots as being affected or unaffected by publication bias. The weighted mean percent correct, which adjusted for the fact that asymmetric plots are more likely to occur. Yes, asymmetric plots are more likely to occur in the presence of publication bias, was also low, 48.3 to 62%, depending on the presence or absence of publication bias and heterogeneous study effects. Oh, let's not do that. So 52.5%. Basically, a coin flip. Cool. Basically, you can't infer publication bias visually. I probably shouldn't have quoted that thing in parentheses. Let's not play games about that. Let's just look at the results. So you can't infer publication bias visually, at least from this experiment done in 2005. Normally, I don't make a big stink about this, but Codex Man went, on one part of his article, he said, what about those viral clearance studies? Oh, that's explained by good old publication bias. And then he just showed a visual of a funnel plot. Okay? And I'll just say it. This is kind of where if you don't know what you're talking about, you don't know what your limits are. And so you may end up saying, you may end up doing things that are actually seemingly more complicated or sophisticated simply because you don't know what you don't know. So now I'm against using viral clearance studies because measurement, maybe it's supposed to be standardized. You'd hope so, but I'd rather not hope that all these guys taking the viral clearance measurements are all doing it, the same way. So just use mortality, skip the games, use death. Death is the only thing close to an objective metric. And even then, not necessarily when you get into people saying cause of death, but dead, not dead, right? You have variable A, variable B. Variable A, you administer ivermectin. Can't screw around with that because you administer it or you don't. The person you administer it to may or may not take it. That's something else. Right? Whether they take it. Okay. But what you're looking at, what is scientific, is whether they take, whether the ivermectin is administered. If it's administered, that's it. And you check that box. And that's objective, and that's done. Right? Whether they take it, whether it gets uptaken into their bloodstream, any of the mechanism, that's not science. That's mechanistic explanation. Okay. Science is variable A, variable B. You got a hypothesis? Neat. You want to go into mechanism? Neat. That's hypothesis. That's hypothesis. But what science is, at least in its original conception, and the only meaningful definition of science is predictive validity, cause, or association between variables and establishing that. Now, if you want to go outside of that and start to engage in a whole bunch of natural philosophy and speculating about mechanisms by which things happen, that's fine. In fact, that's quite valuable. That's what you do to formulate new hypotheses, but don't confuse that. Don't mix mechanism with science, right? And it's tricky, right? And people who mix mechanism with science end up doing something like viral clearance measurements, and you have these studies done like all over the place in different countries. So it's and we're trying to do a meta-analysis of countries done in different labs, different places. It's not, I don't want to hope that they're doing the same thing over and over again. This is kind of why I like standardized tests like the SAT or IQ tests, because you give like one of a set of prescribed answers. It's put into a Scantron or something, and then that's it, right? And the IQ score is what you marked in the bubbles, right? That's the IQ score, right? And so we're looking at the association between what you marked in the bubbles and all sorts of other variables, right? That also can't be dicked around with. I want to go a little bit further and say, even if you do something like subjective employee quality, association between IQ and subjective employee quality, you may think that because I'm such a skeptic of mechanism that I would be skeptical of that. Not at all, because subjective, like the evaluation that a boss gives to an employee, that's an objective thing, right? Whereas viral clearance, that's a measurement taken a certain part of the body at a certain point in time, and from that measurement you infer something bigger. You infer the total amount of the virus, in the body or something. Okay, right? Whereas an employee evaluation is not inferring something bigger. All you're doing when you look at the employee evaluation, that it's what the evaluator said. And that is inherently objective. What the evaluator said is what the evaluator said. That is inherently objective. Now, as for the reasons why he said it, whether he's right in his evaluation, that's a universe of gobbledygook, right? But what he writes down here in the employee evaluation, on like the scale 1 to 10, goodness of employee, that's an objective thing, right? And what the guy bubbles in on the Scantron, on the IQ test, or whatever, that's an objective thing, right? There may be a whole world of subjectivity and hypotheses going on in the background, but at least the operational variables are objective, okay? And I'm not sure that they are with viral clearance. Anyway, so that was a bit of a tangent. Okay, that said, even though I'm against the use of viral clearance studies kind of on principle, I can still appreciate two levels of BS that Codex Man is engaged in here. The first, of course, is the use of the visual funnel analysis. Now, maybe Bitterman in his paper did some maths, which does get a better hit rate for detecting true publication bias and avoiding false negatives and false positives. But in terms of what Codex Man just presented, he presented an image from a tweet from Bitterman and saying, slam dunk, right? And I don't know. I mean, have you guys ever looked at like strings of numbers in a random number generator? But like the idea that this is publication bias here is, I mean, it is what you would expect to see if there was publication bias and you were only looking at this number of studies, or there only existed this number of studies and there was publication bias. This is the pattern that is starting to form that you would expect to see. But again, this is just visual inspection here. I don't think you can conclude publication bias with this few numbers. That's what I would say there. But it's on viral clearance, which I'm not dealing with. Now, Bitterman isn't off the hook either, because Bitterman was he showed this image as if you can detect publication bias from a visual inspection of a funnel plot on his Twitter, which means Bitterman is either ignorant of the fact that this has probably never been evidenced. Now, if he knows of some other study done showing that researchers can visually identify publication bias at a rate greater than a coin flip, then by all means. But I think he's either ignorant of the fact that this has never been evidenced. I think it's never been evidenced that you can actually, infer publication bias by just looking at the funnel, or he's just a liar. I think it's all, as always, I think it's a mixture of both. Like, just not having skepticism for things you want to believe, that is a kind of lying. So that's what I'll leave that at. Now, the second level of BS is, I went into that with statistical significance. It's the inscription miner thing that Codex Man is doing, and he's doing it via Bitterman, it seems like. And this is the same thing that he did with statistical significance. Basically, you have a whole bunch of studies, mostly from Wormland. Then they say, oh, it could be worms. Basically, I have a theory about worms. So most of your cards just get taken off the table, which limits you to studies that are done outside of Wormland. Instead of how many viral clearance studies there are in total, if that's what they're looking at, whatever metric they're looking at, you're limited to only those, for example, viral clearance studies done outside of Wormland. Oh, look, among these remaining studies that we've artificially restricted you to, because we have a theory about worms, we declare publication bias via visual inspection of a funnel plot. At least that's what Codex Man does. I'm not sure if that's what Bitterman does. Bitterman may do some actual math, which now even that I'm not exactly sold on, and I'll get into that. But it's better than just a visual inspection by far. But even then, it's not. It's no fail-safe. So it's taken me a long time to sort of flesh this out. But like when I read Codex Man's article, it was just immediately obvious that these were the two kinds of games that they were doing. So Codex Man, he's doing a novelty take here, right? He's sort of playing smartest man in the room. If ivermectin works, if ivermectin only works where there are worms, and say there are no worms in Paris, why is it working in Paris? This is pretty basic stuff. And then, statistical significance. It's like, okay, well, you go dance with your p-values. I'm interested in reality and things that are actually useful in making predictions and understanding, the mechanism. As much as I shit on mixing science with mechanism, the point of science is mechanism, right? So as an aside, there is another regime flavor problem, because I just look at methodology and results, and I basically don't read the description or abstract unless those things are just presenting, for example, just presenting results or getting a preview of a methodology. And this is why I think academics should just stop having discussion sections and abstracts. I say after having cited one abstract, but in general, it would be better if the discussion section and the abstract were prohibited. Because they say things like there was one study, I think it was the Paris one, where the author found they had the ivermectin group and then they had the control group, and in the ivermectin group, out of 300, 2 died, and then out of the control group 8 died, and then we say we found no statistically significant relation. Buddy, it's okay, so you found no okay, but did you find an actual relation? Yes, but it could be down to chance. And you have a p-value that says that you think tells you what you think, what is down to chance, but not. So, but anyway, whatever. Like your results are going onto the pile. I don't care what you think they mean or what your little p-value dance told you. These, and and it's the same kind of stuff that I see a little bit in race denial, just trying to reject studies using all sorts of mechanisms to say this study is not allowed, to basically take cards off the board, right? And just as a rule of thumb, when someone is trying to take cards off the board, have caution and skepticism about that. It's not a hard and fast rule, right? Because obviously there are topics, there are boundaries, okay? So it's certainly possible to try to bring in things that are extraneous, but just keep an eye out when someone comes up with a theory that can be used to hand wave away a bunch of otherwise very troublesome data for a position that they want to hold, which is another thing. Why do you hold a position? Now, granted, in my previous video, I did make a public commitment to ivermectin working, and a pretty hard one. Okay, so I guess at a psychological level, I do hold a position. But honest engines, I'm ready to take that video down. I'm ready to mea culpa. Okay, wouldn't be the first time that I've done that. I like, that's another thing. I actually have a track record of mea culpaing and taking down videos where I said things that I now think are wrong. It's also one of the reasons why I kind of get annoyed at people who post older videos of mine, because I'm not sure what I said in there. That's one thing. Another is I may say things that I may have taken it down specifically because I found out to my evaluation that I was wrong, right? So yeah, there could be a kind of a psychological commitment on my part from these public commitment, but I believe I have proven myself to fall back to not be fixed in my position after making a public commitment to it. That I have proven that I will reverse my position even after a public commitment. Even one that's as hard as I made in the previous video. But the initial position formation that I came from going just to the IVM meta site and just doing a random spot test of the 6 of the papers that he cited. I then spent 2 hours maybe going through Google Scholar, okay, and Google Scholar, which is the most commonly used research database of actual researchers and PhDs, so don't stop. Like people go, oh, Google Scholar, that's publicly available. Yeah, and it's the best. Okay, so shut up. Like if you say, oh, I don't use Google Scholar, I read the journal. Like, well, the journals are all indexed in Google, so shut up. Like that kind of elitism. And you notice that kind of elitism, like you use Google Scholar, it only comes from people. It comes from non-academics, right? It comes from people who don't know what they're talking about and think that there's some secret stash somewhere. So just as an aside, I've worked with a bunch of guys who make college football power ratings, and the use of statistical significance is fairly rare when they make these ratings. It would be a lie to say it's non-existent, but these power ratings, like, they face the razor of objective judgment every week. And you could say they would benefit from P, but like here's what's kind of bizarre. Like, I regularly get accused of taking normal distributions and standard deviations way too seriously. I'm not. I know what they mean and I know what they don't mean. But P is kind of perhaps the ultimate. I don't know if it's the ultimate, but one of the main biggest reifications of normal distributions and standard deviations. Like, in a real thing, you get material boundings, like real world limits of effects. Take something like adding muscle mass through strength training. There could be a lot of variation, but then you get hard stops or pseudo-hard stops at either a body putting on what was evolutionarily defined as too much or not enough muscle mass. And these are physical material boundaries. And so you can get a lot of variation in that to a point where suddenly you start to get these hard cutoffs. And at root, identification and publication bias is really just detecting violation in normality in kind of a roundabout way, which is only going to be as useful as the distribution of variables, as the distribution of a variable, singular, is normal. Because having a dearth of effect sizes in a particular direction, given the expected results, given the confidence intervals of published studies, okay, expected based on what? Based on normal distribution. And in the real world, everything violates normality to some degree. The idea is just that things in the real world are normal enough that we can use these tools as a heuristic for things like detecting publication bias. So a funnel plot that looks like this is a possible indicator of publication bias. Okay? In the real world, there could just actually be hard material compression of real effects. And I know that this is absolutely true in the realm of betting on college football, that a team's performance values will vary, and if you converted teams' performance values into just data sets and sent them to researchers without telling them what they were, they would almost certainly say that there is publication bias in this data set because you get all these hard cutoffs. Right? Given the confidence intervals and how Ohio State played against Penn State and Michigan State, why don't we get events like Ohio State running up 100 points against Rutgers? Right? Why doesn't Ohio State run up 100 points against Rutgers every year? Right? You do that, a funnel analysis would say something like publication bias, there should be games where that happens. But it doesn't. Right? Now, once you then told these researchers what the material thing college football scores, what material thing the data is referencing, then they'd feel a little bit silly. But they shouldn't feel silly since they're just dutifully using the tools. What's actually happening is that the real world is violating normality to a point that simulates publication bias. Okay? So, now usually the real world is normal enough that these tools are useful. Like, say a funnel analysis or Egger analysis says not enough results in a certain direction. Okay, that's an indicator, nothing else. But then you have to actually evidence publication bias in some other way. And the hell of it is, when hereditarians use these tools to say there's publication bias in stereotype threat research, that's the retort we get. That it's just violation of normality in the real world. So shitlibs, as a rule, don't have some inherent difficulty in grasping the limits of publication bias tests when they want to. Okay, and now I'm not saying Bitterman is being hypocritical because I never heard him poo-poo publication bias analyses for stereotype threat. I'm just saying that if a shitlib comes in here and pretends to not understand the limits of publication bias tests, know that that kind of person would 99% of the time have zero difficulty in understanding the problems of publication bias detection when applied to stereotype threat. So, and also, the viewers understand that you can always counter. Okay? Anything said can always be countered, right? This worms counter is a but because it kind of made me go into these basic things as to why they're doing stupid stuff. All right, and so now I have to deal with p-value and funnel analysis BS. So, and the thing is, this is what's so irritating to me. I literally just went back to the IVM meta list, opened up all the studies and looked where they were done, just the location. Right? And that's something that if you're like, oh, this worm thing sounds interesting, that's something that you should have done immediately if you took this worm argument seriously. So come on, self-solvers. Let's be self-solvers. When we encounter something, let's try to figure it out. It's like, oh, worm. Well, let's go here. Let's make a list, right? Like, make lists. Enjoy making lists. Lists are great. Tables are great. Lists and tables. So, and like, if you made like a worms comment on my video without referencing Czechia or Slovakia, like, and I got some people saying that, and they had this fucking attitude. They had this attitude to them, like they knew, or like they, like, and it's it's like a kind of a hard-nosed attitude. They're like, oh, it's worms, and Ryan's doing a simplistic analysis, and he's not taking into account all this more complex stuff. But like, if you made a worms comment, like in my video, which I'm not even, my previous video where I wasn't even dealing with the worms shit, like, your comment should have referenced Czechia and Slovakia in some way, right? You should have addressed that in your initial comment, right? Like, it doesn't matter, it doesn't mean what I think it means, something, right? So, and if you're that kind of person, I have a request for you, is to stop watching and stop reading anything I make. Obviously, there's no way for me to enforce that. I'm just saying you're not welcome, because you're posting counters without reference on that video, without referencing one very important chart in my original video. If you want to say it's wrong or doesn't mean what I think it means, by all means speak. But when you post it's worms, bro, without addressing something in the very presentation that just so happens to, sort of by happenstance, counter the worms narrative, but you're just gonna, like what the hell are you doing? That's what's so maddening about these kinds of comments. So, and I really don't appreciate this kind of attitude, like, oh, you didn't address this thing, therefore this thing is correct, it stands, you're not sophisticated enough to understand it, right? This kind of like there's an infinite number of things, right? And they're mostly rabbit holes. So that's just what I wanted to say about that. There's going to be more studies on ivermectin coming out from the US. There's one in Bulgaria. So it looks like there's increased interest in ivermectin within being studies done within weird countries. Hopefully they'll have some mortality data, but I think this is going to come to a head eventually anyway. And I think that what they're going to end up doing is replicating the results already extant within weird countries. That is my prediction.